Beneath a canopy of ancient, gnarled trees, shrouded in an almost supernatural fog, Jake stood before the rusted gates of Whistler Grove. The iron bars, twisted and contorted as though melted by unseen hands, bore a faded sign, "Welcome to the show of a lifetime." The words, streaked with rust and grime, seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light of the crescent moon, casting long, spindly shadows across the ground. The air around him was unnaturally still, heavy with an unspoken warning. As Jake hesitated, the faintest echo of distant laughter trickled through the air. It wasn't joyous or innocent. It was fragmented, distorted, and filled with malice, like the voices of unseen spectators mocking him. Stepping through the gate, his flashlight beam cut weakly through the dense mist, illuminating the skeletal remains of long-forgotten attractions. A carousel stood in the distance, its chipped horses frozen in mid-gallop, their hollow eyes staring into oblivion. A gentle creak broke the silence as the carousel began to turn on its own, each rotation accompanied by the discordant notes of a broken calliope. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. He scanned the shadows, but there was no sign of movement, only the sound of the carousel spinning endlessly, as though mocking his presence. The deeper Jake ventured, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The mist seemed alive, curling around him, whispering unintelligible words in his ears. The faint scent of burnt sugar and old popcorn lingered in the air, mingling with an acrid, metallic tang that grew stronger with every step. His heart pounded as his flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of decaying carnival booths. He swore he saw silhouettes in the fog, figures too still to be human, yet too vivid to be shadows. Ahead, a dilapidated Ferris wheel loomed, its rusted frame groaning softly as it swayed in the still air. Jake's attention was drawn to one of the cabins, where he spotted what appeared to be a figure sitting motionless. He raised his flashlight, but the beam was swallowed by the mist before it could reach the top. His hand trembled as he lowered the light, and his ears caught something, soft footsteps echoing behind him. Turning sharply, he found nothing but the eerie stillness of the park. Suddenly, a low, guttural hum reverberated through the air, emanating from the park's central tent, its tattered canvas flapping in a non-existent breeze. The hum rose in pitch, transforming into a sound resembling a child's laughter mixed with static. Jake's legs felt rooted to the spot as the laughter grew louder, more menacing, bouncing off the dilapidated structures around him. The fog thickened, pressing against his skin like icy fingers, and for the first time, he felt truly unwelcome. His instincts screamed for him to turn back, to run, but his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. Something wasn't right about this place, and he needed to uncover its secrets. The laughter abruptly stopped, plunging the park into an oppressive silence so thick that even the faintest rustle of his jacket sounded deafening. Jake's eyes darted to the ground, where he noticed a trail of footprints, fresh, wet, and leading deeper into the park. They weren't his own. With his flashlight barely functioning, Jake followed the trail, each step pulling him closer to the massive central tent. Its weathered stripes of red and white were smeared with something dark, and the words painted above the entrance, though nearly illegible, sent a chill down his spine. The greatest show never ends. As he stepped inside, the scent of decay hit him like a wall, and the faint sound of a music box began to play, a haunting tune that he couldn't shake from his memory. The shadows in the tent moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing along the canvas walls. His heart raced as he caught a glimpse of something darting just out of view, a shape too fast, too distorted to be real. The music box stopped abruptly, and the darkness seemed to close in around him. A single voice, cold and raspy, whispered in his ear, "Welcome back, Jake." Jake stood frozen inside the tent, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the chilling voice echoed in his mind. "Welcome back, Jake." The words lingered, heavy with familiarity, but he couldn't place where he had heard them before. The darkness seemed alive, pulsating with malevolence, as if the tent itself had been waiting for him to arrive. His flashlight flickered erratically, and in the brief moments of light, Jake noticed an object glinting on the ground. Kneeling cautiously, he picked it up, a small, tarnished locket. As his fingers brushed against the locket's surface, a flood of memories surged through his mind, disjointed and chaotic. A child's laughter, a warm summer evening, a faint melody carried on the wind. But the memories were fractured, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Jake's hands trembled as he opened the locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy and an older woman, their faces blurred with time. His stomach turned as he realized the boy was him, though he had no memory of when the photograph had been taken. A sudden chill swept through the tent, and the faint sound of a music box began playing again, its haunting tune reverberating through the air. The melody was eerily familiar, striking a chord deep within Jake's subconscious. It was the same tune that had haunted his nightmares as a child. His flashlight beam danced across the tent walls, revealing faded posters of a smiling ringmaster. The face looked eerily similar to the man in his grandmother's old photographs, though his name, Edgar Holt, meant nothing to Jake. The locket grew colder in his hand, and a faint whisper began to emanate from it. "Don't you remember?" The voice rasped, its tone both pleading and accusing. Jake's heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a malevolent wind. Shadows began to writhe along the walls, taking the form of ghostly figures. Children holding balloons, performers with hollow eyes, and the unmistakable silhouette of the ringmaster. Each figure seemed to reach for him, their arms stretching unnaturally long, their faces contorted in silent screams. Jake stumbled backward, his mind racing. Memories began to resurface in fragments, visits to a carnival as a child, his grandmother holding his hand, and the same haunting melody playing in the background. He remembered her warning him never to return to Whistler Grove, though he had no recollection of why. Her words came back to him like a thunderclap. "This place steals what you love most." Desperate for answers, Jake's gaze landed on a dusty chest in the corner of the tent, its lid slightly ajar. He approached it cautiously, the whispers growing louder with each step. Inside, he found a collection of objects, a child's drawing of a smiling ringmaster, a broken carousel figurine, and a weathered journal bound in cracked leather. The journal seemed to call to him, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. Opening the journal, Jake was greeted by frantic, scrawled handwriting. The entries detailed the downfall of the carnival, its performers vanishing one by one, and the ringmaster's desperate attempts to keep the show alive. The final entry chilled him to his core. "The park is alive. It demands a soul to sustain it. Tonight, I make the ultimate sacrifice. If you are reading this, you are part of its design." Jake's hands shook as the locket began to glow faintly, its whispers now deafening. The photograph inside had changed. Now it showed only the ringmaster, his eyes dark pits of void staring directly at Jake. A searing pain shot through his hand, and he dropped the locket, which clattered to the ground with a sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the empty space. The music box melody grew louder, almost mocking, as the shadows in the tent began to converge. The voices around him chanted in unison, "Welcome back, Jake. It's your turn." His mind raced as he realized the truth. His grandmother had brought him here as a child, and somehow he had escaped. But the park hadn't forgotten him, and now it wanted what it was owed. The shadows grew closer, their ghostly hands reaching for him. The journal's final words burned in his mind. "You are part of its design." Jake screamed as the tent seemed to collapse inward, the air thick with whispers and the music box's haunting tune. He was no longer just an intruder in Whistler Grove. He was a player in a game that had been set in motion long before he was born. Jake stumbled out of the tent, gasping for air, but the oppressive fog outside offered no respite. The carnival had changed. What was once still and decaying now felt alive, watching his every move. The distant laughter was louder, more menacing, blending with the hum of the rides that were now inexplicably functioning. Lights flickered to life across the park, casting unnatural, twisting shadows on the cracked pavement. Jake clutched the weathered journal to his chest, its weight a reminder of the ominous words written inside. "It demands a soul to sustain it." Ahead of him, the path split into two directions. To the left, a rusted sign pointed toward the Hall of Reflections. The air seemed colder there, the fog thicker, as if the very space repelled him. To the right, flickering neon lights marked the entrance to the final act, a massive tent looming in the distance, its striped canvas rippling as though alive. From inside came faint whispers, calling his name. The whispers weren't pleading, they were hungry. Jake's heart pounded as he stood paralyzed between the two paths. A low growl reverberated through the air, and he turned to see shadows gathering behind him. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that resembled people. People who had once been alive but were now little more than formless specters. Their hollow eyes stared at him with a mixture of hatred and despair. Slowly, they began to advance, forcing Jake to make a decision. As he turned toward the Hall of Reflections, the journal slipped from his grasp, landing with a muffled thud on the damp ground. Its pages fluttered open, and a single line of text glowed faintly. "Face the truth or embrace the end." Jake swallowed hard, dread coursing through his veins as he approached the hall. The broken mirrors lining the entrance reflected distorted images of himself. His face elongated, his eyes sunken and hollow, as though they were showing a version of him consumed by the carnival. Inside, the hall was suffocatingly silent. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the shattered mirrors that stretched endlessly down the narrow corridor. As Jake moved deeper, the reflections began to change. They no longer showed his distorted image. Instead, they revealed fragments of his past. In one mirror, he saw himself as a boy, laughing as he held his grandmother's hand. But the laughter turned to screams as her face twisted in agony, her body dragged into the darkness by unseen forces. In another reflection, he saw the Ringmaster, Edgar Holt, standing behind him, his face inches from Jake's neck. Jake spun around, but there was nothing there, only the cold, empty corridor stretching endlessly behind him. The reflections grew more sinister with each step, showing scenes Jake didn't remember but felt in his bones. His grandmother bargaining with the Ringmaster, offering something precious to save him. At the end of the corridor, Jake found himself standing before a grand mirror unlike the others. Its frame was ornate, gilded with carvings of grinning faces and weeping figures. The glass was impossibly clear, reflecting not his current self but a version of him that radiated darkness, his eyes black voids, and his smile cruel. As Jake stared, the reflection spoke, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. Choose, Jake. Sacrifice or submission. The carnival must be fed. Behind him, the shadows from the mirrors began to pour out, converging into a single entity, a towering, faceless figure with countless arms reaching toward him. Its presence was suffocating, its very existence a manifestation of despair. Jake's mind raced as the reflection continued. Give the park what it wants, or let it take you. You can end this, but not without a price. The journal's final words flashed in his memory. It demands a soul to sustain it. Jake realized the choice before him. He could destroy the mirror, severing the carnival's hold on him, but dooming someone else in his place. Or he could surrender himself, becoming part of the park's eternal nightmare, but sparing others from its grasp. His hands trembled as the shadows closed in. The mirror pulsed, beckoning him closer, its surface rippling like water. Jake's reflection grinned wider, its voice a low hiss. Decide, Jake. The show must go on. Jake stood frozen before the grand mirror, his mind unraveling as the reflection's dark grin mocked his indecision. The towering shadow creature behind him pulsed and writhed, its elongated arms reaching closer, the sound of its movements like the crackling of dry bones. The air grew colder, biting into his skin, and the oppressive silence of the Hall of Reflections was broken by a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to echo from every shattered mirror around him. At first, the whisper was unintelligible, a faint hiss carried by the icy wind. But as Jake strained to listen, it grew louder, more distinct, its tone both soothing and malevolent. It called his name repeatedly, stretching each syllable like a serpent slithering into his ear. Jayaki. Jayaki. The voice was familiar, disturbingly so, as though it belonged to someone he once knew. His grandmother? A childhood friend? No, it was him. His own voice, but twisted darker, laced with a cruel amusement that chilled him to his core. The mirrors around him began to vibrate, the jagged fragments trembling as if alive. Each shard reflected fleeting images of his worst fears. Faceless figures watching him from the darkness, an endless void consuming him, and the sight of himself in the mirror, standing still as the shadow creature enveloped him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one telling him something different. One voice pleaded, "Run, Jake. Run while you still can." Another warned, "It's too late. You belong to us now." But the darkest voice, the one from the grand mirror, cut through the others like a knife. "You can't run, Jake. You've always been here. This is where you belong." The mirror's surface rippled, and Jake's reflection stepped out. Not a perfect duplicate, but a twisted, hollow version of him. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. The reflection tilted its head, studying him like prey, before whispering, "Don't you see? You're already part of the carnival. You've been chosen." Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling as the shadow creature behind him loomed closer, its countless arms grazing his shoulders. He could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, as it leaned in, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The words were ancient and guttural, but their intent was clear. They were binding him, sealing his fate. Desperate, Jake turned to the grand mirror, his reflection still standing there, grinning. He screamed at it, demanding answers, but the reflection only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent shivers down his spine. The whispers around him intensified, now coming from the very walls, the mirrors, and even the ground beneath his feet. They were taunting him, reminding him of every failure, every regret, every moment of weakness he had ever experienced. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The shadow creature stopped, its arms frozen mid-reach, as if waiting for something. Jake's heart pounded in the eerie stillness, and then, without warning, a single whisper broke the silence. "The carnival sees all, Jake. And it knows your secret." Jake's knees buckled as memories he had buried deep within himself came flooding back. He remembered the carnival as a child, his grandmother's desperate pleas to leave, and his own curiosity that led him to wander off. He had been drawn to the Hall of Reflections even then, and something had happened, something he couldn't fully recall, but that left him with the scar on his hand and nightmares that never truly went away. The grand mirror rippled again, and this time, Jake saw not his twisted reflection, but a scene from his past. A younger version of himself stood in the carnival, holding his grandmother's hand as she argued with the ringmaster. Her voice was frantic, begging for mercy, as Edgar Holt smirked, tipping his top hat in a mock bow. Jake watched in horror as his grandmother handed over a small golden locket, the same one he had found earlier. The whisper returned, louder and clearer this time. "She bargained for your soul, Jake. And now the carnival wants what it's owed." Jake clutched his head, the weight of the truth crushing him. The whispers were relentless, their voices weaving together into a chilling chant. The carnival must be fed. The carnival must be fed. The shadow creature resumed its advance, its cold fingers brushing against his neck. Jake's gaze darted back to the grand mirror, where his twisted reflection held out a hand. "Come with me, Jake," it whispered, its voice soft yet commanding. "Embrace the truth. The show is waiting for you." The hall began to collapse around him, the mirrors shattering one by one as the shadow creature enveloped him. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and Jake knew there was no escape. He had to choose, surrender to the darkness or fight against it, though he knew the price would be steep. With trembling hands, he reached out toward the mirror, his reflection grinning wider as their fingers touched. And then the lights went out. When the lights returned, the Hall of Reflections was gone. Jake found himself standing in the center of the carnival, but it wasn't the decayed ruin he had first entered. The rides were alive, gleaming with vibrant colors and swirling lights that felt both enchanting and menacing. The air was thick with the scent of fresh popcorn and cotton candy, but underneath lingered a metallic tang, faint but unmistakable, the scent of blood. The carousel spun slowly, its once frozen horses now galloping as though alive, their painted eyes glinting with malice. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its cabins swinging gently despite the still air. Laughter echoed from the games and attractions, but it wasn't human. It was guttural, distorted, the sound of unseen entities mocking him. Jake's head throbbed, the whispers from the mirrors still echoing faintly in his ears. The carnival sees all. The carnival knows. He stumbled forward, his vision blurred, and found himself drawn toward the funhouse, its entrance a grotesque clown face with a gaping mouth serving as the door. The painted eyes of the clown seemed to follow him, narrowing as he approached. From inside, he could hear faint music, a haunting, fractured tune that seemed to shift with each note, tugging at his emotions. It was familiar, yet wrong, like a half-remembered nightmare. As he stepped through the clown's mouth, the music grew louder, and with it came a voice, soft and seductive. "Welcome, Jake. Don't you want to know the truth?" The voice slithered through his mind, pulling at his deepest fears and desires. The funhouse's distorted mirrors reflected fragments of his life, his greatest failures, his moments of shame, and the people he had let down. Each image was exaggerated, warped, as though the mirrors were feeding on his insecurities. The path twisted and turned, leading him through corridors that seemed endless. The walls closed in, the air grew thin, and Jake's pulse quickened. He came to a dead end where a single mirror stood, tall and imposing, its surface rippling like water. In the reflection, he saw not himself, but a version of him consumed by terror, his face pale, his eyes wide with dread, and his body trembling uncontrollably. The reflection whispered to him, its voice trembling with fear, "You can't escape. You never could." Suddenly, the room around him shifted. The walls melted away, and Jake found himself in a dark forest, the carnival lights flickering in the distance. The whispers returned, louder now, speaking in a chorus. "Fear is the key. Fear sustains us." Shadows moved between the trees, their forms fluid and unearthly. They circled him, their voices filling his mind with doubt. "Why fight it, Jake? You've always belonged here." The ground beneath him turned to black sludge, dragging him down as he struggled to move. From the shadows emerged figures, his grandmother, her face hollow and lifeless, the ringmaster, his grin stretching unnaturally wide, and himself, the twisted reflection from the Hall of Reflections. They surrounded him, their voices blending into one. "Give in, Jake. The fear will set you free." Jake screamed, thrashing against the sludge that pulled at his legs. His grandmother's figure stepped closer, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. She reached out a hand, her voice soft but filled with sorrow. "Jake, you can end this. But you must accept what you've done." He shook his head violently, refusing to listen, but the whispers grew louder, pressing against his sanity. Visions assaulted him, fragments of memories buried deep within his mind. He saw himself as a child, wandering away from his grandmother in the carnival, drawn by the sound of the music box. He saw the ringmaster waiting for him, his smile predatory, as he whispered promises of wonder and joy. He saw his grandmother begging for his safety, offering something precious to save him. And then the final memory, her being dragged into the shadows while he fled, clutching the locket she had left behind. The truth hit him like a hammer. The fear he felt wasn't just for his own survival. It was guilt, festering and growing over the years. The carnival had fed on it, using it to draw him back. The shadowy figures around him laughed, their voices blending into a single, haunting chant. Fear is the key. Fear binds you. Fear frees you. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the locket still hanging around his neck. It glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The voices screamed at him, some urging him to destroy it, others begging him to hold on to it. His mind swirled with indecision, the weight of his guilt and the temptation of release battling for control. The carnival around him began to shift, the lights flickering erratically, the ground cracking and splitting beneath his feet. He had to choose, give in to the fear and become part of the carnival forever, or confront it, no matter the cost. As the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, Jake screamed into the void, the locket burning in his hand. The air around him grew still, and the shadows froze, waiting. The carnival demanded his choice. Jake stood trembling, clutching the locket as it pulsed with a searing heat, its golden surface burning into his palm. Around him, the carnival warped and shifted, its form no longer constrained by the laws of reality. The carousel spun faster, its horses breaking free and galloping in circles, their hollow eyes blazing with unnatural light. The Ferris wheel creaked and groaned as its cabins twisted into grotesque shapes, transforming into cages holding shadowy figures that screamed silently. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the park itself was breathing, waiting for Jake to act. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling his mind with an unbearable cacophony. "Choose, Jake. The show cannot stop. The carnival must be fed." The voices came from everywhere, above, below, within him, demanding his submission. The shadow creature loomed in the distance, its many arms stretching impossibly long, each one tipped with clawed fingers that scraped against the air, producing a sound like nails on glass. It was watching him, waiting for his decision. In the center of it all stood the ringmaster, Edgar Holt, his face illuminated by a sickly yellow glow emanating from the grand tent. His top hat was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. His eyes, black as coal, locked onto Jake with a gaze that pierced through him. Edgar raised his hands theatrically, his voice booming, yet unnervingly calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, our grand finale awaits. Will our brave hero take his place among the stars, or will he shatter the illusion?" Jake's knees buckled under the weight of the moment. His vision blurred as memories continued to assault him. The laughter of his grandmother, the pleading in her voice as she begged Edgar to spare Jake, and her final scream as the shadows swallowed her whole. The guilt was crushing, and the carnival fed on it, growing stronger with every passing second. The locket in his hand began to glow brighter, its light pushing back the encroaching darkness. The whispers screamed in protest, and the shadow creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jake realized that the locket was a key, his grandmother's final act of defiance against the carnival's malevolence. But using it would come at a cost. "End this," a voice echoed from the locket, a voice unmistakably his grandmother's. It was faint, almost drowned out by the cacophony around him, but it carried a strength that cut through the chaos. "You know what you must do, Jake." Jake's heart raced as he stepped toward the grand tent, its entrance now a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The whispers grew frantic, their tones shifting from commanding to desperate. "Don't do it, Jake. You'll destroy everything. You'll destroy yourself." The shadow creature lunged forward, its massive form blocking his path, but the locket's light flared, forcing it back with an inhuman shriek. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls pulsed like living flesh, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The center ring was illuminated by a single spotlight, and beneath it stood a mirror, no longer grand and gilded but cracked and blackened, its surface swirling with dark energy. The mirror's reflection showed Jake, but not as he was. It showed him consumed by the carnival, his eyes voids of darkness, his body twisted and deformed, a new puppet for the park to command. Edgar appeared beside the mirror, his grin never faltering. He extended a hand toward Jake, his voice a poisonous whisper. "You have a choice, my boy. Embrace the carnival, and I will release you from your guilt. You will never feel fear again. Or destroy it, and lose everything." Jake's grip tightened on the locket, its heat now almost unbearable. He looked into the mirror, and for a fleeting moment he saw not himself, but his grandmother. Her face was tired but resolute, her eyes filled with determination. She mouthed a single word, "Finish." Jake raised the locket, its light growing blinding, and hurled it at the mirror with all his strength. The impact shattered the glass, releasing an ear-splitting wail as the carnival began to convulse. The ground beneath him split open, revealing a swirling abyss of darkness that threatened to consume everything. Edgar screamed in rage, his form unraveling as the light from the locket engulfed him. The shadow creature shrieked, its arms flailing as it was pulled into the abyss. The rides around Jake collapsed, their once lively forms disintegrating into ash. The whispers turned into agonized screams before fading into silence. Jake fell to his knees, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. As the light subsided, the carnival was gone. Jake found himself standing in an empty field, the locket lying at his feet, now cold and lifeless. He picked it up, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandma." The guilt still lingered, but the oppressive weight of the carnival was gone. Yet, as he turned to leave, a faint laugh echoed in the distance, a laugh that sent chills down his spine. Jake looked back, but the field was empty. Still, the lingering sound carried a chilling promise. The show must go on. The field seemed calm now, the carnival erased as though it had never existed. Yet Jake felt the lingering dread in his bones. The faint laugh that echoed in the distance was growing louder, bouncing off the unseen walls of the void that seemed to surround him. The air thickened again, charged with a malevolence that refused to die. As Jake clutched the now cold locket in his trembling hand, the ground beneath him shifted, turning soft and unstable. The peace was an illusion, the nightmare was far from over. Without warning, the earth opened beneath his feet, dragging him into a swirling vortex of shadows and screams. Jake tried to claw his way out, but the force was too strong. He tumbled downward, his body twisting in ways that defied logic, as distorted faces emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes and toothless mouths screaming in silence. The descent felt endless, but then, with a bone-jarring impact, Jake landed on the floor of the grand tent, restored and pulsating with a sinister energy. The mirror he had shattered stood whole once again in the center of the ring, but its surface was no longer reflective. It was black, alive, writhing with dark tendrils that reached out, searching for him. Around the mirror stood the shadow creature, its amorphous form towering over Jake, and Edgar Holt, the Ringmaster, who was no longer a man. His flesh glowed faintly with an eerie blue light, his features distorted into something grotesque yet still disturbingly human. His grin was wider than ever, his teeth sharp and gleaming. His top hat floated above his head, spinning slowly, defying gravity. "Well, well, Jake," Edgar said, his voice smooth and venomous. "You thought you could destroy the carnival? You thought you could escape its grasp? Foolish boy." His words echoed unnaturally, as though the tent itself was speaking through him. "This place isn't bound by light or time, or even death. It's eternal. And now so are you." Jake struggled to stand, the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on him. The locket in his hand began to glow faintly again, but Edgar's eyes locked onto it, and with a flick of his wrist, the glow faded. "Ah, the last remnant of her defiance," Edgar sneered. "Your grandmother's sacrifice was noble, but ultimately futile. This place feeds on fear, and you, oh, you're a banquet." The shadow creature advanced, its many arms extending toward Jake, each clawed finger dripping with an oily black substance that hissed when it hit the ground. Jake backed away, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no plan. The locket had failed him. The whispers returned, now louder and more chaotic than ever, drowning his thoughts. Then something changed. From the corner of his eye, Jake noticed a faint glow emanating from the ground. It was a trail of light, subtle but steady, leading away from the center ring. The whispers grew more frantic, as though trying to distract him from the light. Edgar noticed it too, and his grin faltered. "No," the ringmaster roared, his voice shattering the silence like thunder. "You cannot follow that path. It is not meant for you." Jake hesitated, but the light seemed to pull him forward, a beacon in the darkness. The shadow creature lunged, its claws narrowly missing him as he rolled to the side and sprinted toward the glowing trail. The whispers screamed in protest, and Edgar's laughter turned into a guttural roar. The tent warped around Jake, the walls twisting and closing in as though the carnival itself was trying to trap him. The trail led him to a smaller, unassuming tent, its entrance flanked by 2 flickering torches. Inside, the air was still and heavy, but the oppressive whispers were gone. At the center of the tent was a pedestal, and atop it sat a broken shard of the mirror he had destroyed earlier. The shard pulsed with the same light as the trail, and Jake realized its significance. He reached for it, but as his fingers brushed the surface, a shock of cold shot through his body, and his vision blurred. He was no longer in the tent, but standing in the carnival as it had been decades ago, alive, bustling with joy and laughter. He saw his younger self running through the crowd, his grandmother chasing after him. He saw Edgar, human and charismatic, tipping his hat to the crowd as he ushered them toward the attractions. But beneath the charm, Jake now saw the truth, the flicker of darkness in Edgar's eyes, the subtle way he guided people toward the Hall of Reflections. The scene shifted, and Jake saw his grandmother arguing with Edgar, offering him the locket in exchange for Jake's life. But this time, he saw what happened next. Edgar accepted the locket, but the carnival demanded more. Jake watched in horror as his grandmother was dragged into the shadows, her screams echoing through the park. The vision faded, and Jake was back in the tent, the shard glowing brightly in his hand. He turned to see Edgar and the shadow creature looming in the entrance. "You can't escape this," Edgar hissed. "The carnival demands a sacrifice, and you are the perfect offering." Jake's grip tightened on the shard. He realized that the carnival didn't just feed on fear. It thrived on guilt, on unresolved pain. And he had been carrying that guilt his entire life. The shard pulsed in his hand, and Jake felt a surge of strength, a clarity he hadn't felt before. He stepped forward, holding the shard high. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Jake said, his voice steady. "And I'm not your victim." The shard exploded with light, engulfing the tent and everything within it. The shadow creature screamed, its form dissolving into nothingness. Edgar writhed, his body fracturing like glass as the light consumed him. The whispers faded into silence, and the tent collapsed around Jake. When the light dimmed, Jake found himself back in the empty field. The locket was gone, and the carnival had vanished completely. The air was still, and the faint hum of the world returning to normal filled his ears. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the carnival was still watching, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a faint laugh echoed once more. Jake walked through the empty field, his footsteps crunching against the brittle grass. The oppressive weight of the carnival was gone, but the silence that followed was almost worse. The locket had vanished, the pulsing light extinguished, and the shadowy figures that had haunted him were nowhere to be seen. Yet, in his heart, Jake felt an unease that refused to fade. It wasn't over, not entirely. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, the horizon obscured by a faint, unnatural haze. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long, eerie shadows. As Jake moved, he realized the field wasn't as empty as it seemed. Scattered across the ground were remnants of the carnival, broken pieces of the carousel, shattered mirrors from the Hall of Reflections, and scraps of fabric from the Ringmaster's tent. Each piece was old and weathered, as if decades had passed since the carnival's collapse. He picked up a fragment of mirror, its surface cracked and darkened. For a moment, he thought he saw something move within its depths, a faint shadow, almost imperceptible. He dropped the shard instinctively, his pulse quickening. The shard landed with a soft thud, and a faint whisper echoed in his ears. The show must go on. Jake froze, scanning the field for any signs of movement, but it was empty. The whisper had sounded distant, almost like a memory, yet it sent a chill down his spine. He pressed on, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the remnants of the carnival. As he walked, the haze thickened, and the field seemed to warp around him. The grass grew taller and wilder, brushing against his legs like grasping fingers. He tried to shake off the sensation, but it grew stronger with each step, as if the field itself was alive. The air became heavy, and Jake's breath quickened. He looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow creature or Edgar Holt grinning at him from the darkness. But there was nothing, only the faint rustle of the grass. Ahead, a faint light appeared, flickering like a candle in the distance. Jake felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though it was calling him. As he approached, the light grew stronger, revealing an old wooden sign staked into the ground. The letters carved into the wood were faded, but Jake could still make them out. Whistler Grove Carnival, reopening soon. A cold dread settled over him. The sign looked ancient, yet the wood was untouched by time or decay. Fresh paint glistened on the surface, as if it had just been carved. The flickering light came from a lantern hanging above the sign, its flame swaying gently despite the still air. Jake reached out to touch the sign, but the moment his fingers grazed the wood, the flame extinguished, plunging him into darkness. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They surrounded him, coming from every direction, each voice speaking a different word. Guilt, fear, sacrifice, return. Jake clapped his hands over his ears, but the whispers burrowed into his mind, relentless and inescapable. The ground beneath him trembled, and a faint, haunting melody began to play, the same tune from the music box in the Hall of Reflections. The haze lifted, revealing the carnival once again. But this time, it was more sinister than ever. The lights were dim, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. The rides creaked and groaned, their forms twisted and unnatural. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, its cabins empty except for faint silhouettes that vanished when Jake tried to focus on them. At the center of it all stood the grand tent, its stripes faded and torn, but still radiating an unholy energy. The entrance flapped in the wind, beckoning Jake to come closer. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder, forming a single, cohesive sentence. You can't leave, Jake. The carnival isn't done with you. Jake's heart raced as he tried to resist the pull of the tent. He turned and ran, but the field stretched endlessly, the carnival always looming in the distance no matter how far he went. The whispers taunted him, their tone mocking and cruel. You're part of the show now. You always have been. Exhausted, Jake fell to his knees, the weight of the whispers crushing him. He looked up and saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the distance. It was his grandmother, her face pale and sorrowful. She reached out to him, her voice faint but clear. Jake, it's not over. You have to break the cycle. Tears streamed down his face as he reached for her, but the figure faded into the mist. The whispers laughed, and the melody from the music box grew louder, almost deafening. Jake looked down at his hands and saw the locket again, its surface glowing faintly. It was cracked, its light flickering, but it still held a spark of hope. He stood, clutching the locket tightly. The carnival loomed ahead, its malevolence palpable, but Jake's resolve hardened. He didn't know how to break the cycle, but he knew he couldn't let it claim him. As he took a step forward, the whispers fell silent, replaced by a single voice, the voice of the Ringmaster, cold and triumphant. The show must go on, Jake. And you're the star. The field vanished, and Jake found himself standing once again before the grand mirror, its surface dark and swirling. The reflection smiled back at him, not as a distorted version of himself, but as Edgar Holt. The mirror pulsed, and the carnival roared to life. Jake realized the truth. He wasn't free. He had never been free. The carnival was eternal, and now, so was he.